The morning started like any other Tuesday for Viktor Antonov. He sat in his Berlin apartment sipping coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at sheet music he'd memorized years before. At 52 years old, he'd played in nearly every major concert hall across Europe: Carnegie Hall, La Scala, the Vienna State Opera. His calendar was booked solid for the next 18 months, so when his assistant knocked on the door holding a cream-colored envelope with a British postage stamp, he barely looked up. "Another invitation," she said, placing it on the piano. "This one looks fancy." Viktor didn't respond immediately. He was known for two things in the classical music world. First, his ability to play Rachmaninoff's most challenging pieces as if they were simple nursery rhymes. Second, his complete lack of patience for pretentious ceremony. While other pianists smiled through endless cocktail parties and donor dinners, Viktor showed up, played brilliantly, and left. He didn't do small talk. He didn't pretend to enjoy champagne that tasted like expensive vinegar, and he certainly didn't get excited about fancy envelopes, but his assistant knew him well. She stood there waiting, a small smile on her face. "What?" he finally asked. "It's from the Royal Albert Hall." That got his attention. He set down his coffee cup and picked up the envelope. The weight of it felt substantial. Real paper, not the thin stuff most venues used. He opened it carefully and pulled out a letter written in elegant script. They wanted him to perform in 6 weeks. A special evening concert. Solo performance. Full orchestra accompaniment available if desired. The fee they offered was generous, though Viktor had stopped caring much about money a decade ago. What caught his eye was the final paragraph. There was something odd about the wording. They mentioned specifically that he would be performing on their historic and irreplaceable 1847 Broadwood piano, which has graced our stage for over a century. They emphasized this point 3 separate times in a 2-page letter. Viktor read the letter again, then a third time. Something felt off. In his experience, when venues bragged this much about their instruments, it usually meant one of two things. Either the piano was genuinely spectacular, or it was a disaster they refused to replace for sentimental reasons. "Well?" his assistant asked. "They want me to play on a specific piano. A very old one." "That's good, isn't it? Historic instruments can be beautiful." Viktor made a non-committal sound. He'd played on historic instruments before. Some were magnificent, maintained with obsessive care by expert craftsmen. Others were like playing on furniture. Pretty to look at, terrible to actually use. "I'll need to think about it," he said. But his assistant knew that tone. It meant he was already composing his acceptance email in his head. Viktor couldn't resist a challenge, and something about this invitation intrigued him. Maybe it was the mystery of the piano. Maybe it was the chance to play at such an iconic venue. Or maybe, after 20 years of performing the same pieces in similar halls, he was just bored enough to try something different. 3 days later, he arrived in London for a preliminary meeting. The Royal Albert Hall stood impressive and imposing under gray British skies. Viktor had performed there once before, 15 years ago, but in a different hall. This invitation was for their main auditorium, the crown jewel of the venue. Inside, he was escorted through corridors lined with photographs of legendary performers: Pavarotti, Elton John. Churchill had given speeches here. The Beatles had played here. The weight of history pressed down from every wall. He was led to a conference room where 3 people waited. The venue director, Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, sat at the head of the table. She was probably in her 60s with silver hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Her handshake was firm to the point of aggressive. "Mr. Antonov, we're delighted you've accepted our invitation," she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Viktor nodded politely and sat down. The other 2 people introduced themselves, but he immediately forgot their names. They seemed nervous, like middle managers at a meeting they didn't want to attend. Mrs. Pemberton launched into what felt like a prepared speech. She talked about the venue's history, its importance to British culture, its royal patronage. Viktor listened patiently, though he wondered when they'd get to the point. Finally, she began discussing the piano. Our 1847 Broadwood is not just an instrument, she said, her voice taking on an almost reverent tone. It's a piece of living history. It's been played by some of the greatest musicians who ever lived. We've had it restored multiple times, always using period-appropriate techniques. May I see it? Victor asked. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. Of course. But first, I need you to understand the significance of what you'll be playing. This isn't just any performance. You'll be connecting with over a century of musical tradition. Victor maintained his polite expression, but internally, he was starting to feel concerned. In his experience, the more someone talked about an instrument's history, the less they wanted to talk about its current condition. We have certain protocols, Mrs. Pemberton continued. The piano requires a specific touch. Previous performers have found it has a unique character that demands sensitivity and respect. Every piano has character, Victor said mildly. That's what makes them interesting. Yes, but this one is special. I trust you'll approach it with the appropriate reverence. There it was. That word, reverence. Victor had spent 3 decades mastering his instrument. He'd studied under the best teachers in Russia. He'd performed thousands of concerts. And here was someone who probably couldn't play chopsticks telling him to approach a piano with reverence. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Mrs. Pemberton, I assure you, I treat every instrument with respect, but I'd really like to see the piano now. She looked like she wanted to say more, but something in Victor's tone made her reconsider. She stood up stiffly. Very well. Follow me. They walked through more corridors, down a flight of stairs, and finally emerged onto the stage. The auditorium stretched out before them, row upon row of empty red seats rising up into shadows. It was magnificent. And there, center stage under a single spotlight, sat the piano. Victor approached it slowly. From a distance, it looked beautiful. The wood was polished to a deep shine. The craftsmanship was obvious even from several feet away. But as he got closer, he noticed small details. The way the wood had warped slightly near the base. The keys that seemed just a bit uneven. He sat down at the bench. Mrs. Pemberton stood behind him watching. May I? He asked. Gently, she said. Victor placed his hands on the keys and played a simple scale. His face remained neutral, but his heart sank. The action was stiff. Several keys stuck slightly. The tone was muddy in the lower register and harsh in the upper. This wasn't a historic treasure. This was a problem. He played a few more notes, testing different sections of the keyboard. It got worse the more he explored. Mrs. Pemberton cleared her throat. Beautiful, isn't it? That authentic 19th century sound. Victor stood up from the bench. He looked at the piano, then at Mrs. Pemberton, then back at the piano. In that moment, he realized exactly what kind of performance this was going to be. Victor didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about that piano. In his hotel room, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, running through possible solutions in his mind. He'd faced difficult instruments before. Once in Prague, he'd performed on a piano missing 2 strings. In Moscow, he dealt with a venue so cold his fingers went numb between pieces. But this was different. This wasn't about working around a problem. This was about an entire organization pretending a problem didn't exist. The next morning, he arrived early for rehearsal. The orchestra was already setting up when he walked in. 40 musicians adjusting their chairs, tuning their instruments, chatting quietly. The conductor, an energetic man named Peter Westbrook, bounded over to shake his hand. Victor. Wonderful to finally meet you. I've been a fan for years. Heard you play in Vienna back in 2019. Absolutely brilliant. Victor appreciated genuine enthusiasm. He smiled, actually meaning it this time. Thank you. I hope you're ready for an interesting rehearsal. Oh, we're ready for anything. We've accompanied some of the best pianists in the world on this stage. Victor glanced at the piano, sitting there looking innocent under the stage lights. Have any of them mentioned problems with the instrument? Peter's smile flickered just slightly. Well, you know how it is. Every piano has its quirks. You'll adapt. You're a professional. There was that phrase again. Victor was starting to hate it. Being professional didn't mean pretending a broken tool was working fine. It meant doing your best work despite challenges. But he kept these thoughts to himself and took his seat at the piano. Mrs. Pemberton arrived moments later, clipboard in hand, settling into a seat in the 5th row. Victor noticed she sat exactly where the acoustics would be worst. Probably on purpose. "Whenever you're ready, maestro," Peter called out, raising his baton. Victor had chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 for this performance. It was one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. People called it one of the hardest pieces ever written for piano. Victor had played it hundreds of times. He could perform it in his sleep, but that was on normal pianos. He placed his hands on the keys and began the opening passage. Immediately, everything felt wrong. The keys required too much pressure, making his normally fluid movements feel labored. 3 bars in, one key stuck completely. He had to strike it twice to get a sound. The orchestra, professional as they were, kept playing, but he could see confused glances being exchanged. Victor pushed through the first movement. It was like trying to run a marathon in shoes 2 sizes too small. Every phrase that should have flowed naturally instead felt forced and clumsy. The middle register sounded fine, but anything in the lower octaves came out muddy and indistinct. The upper register was harsh, almost painful to listen to. When he reached the cadenza, the solo section where the piano was supposed to shine, Victor felt actual frustration building. This was the moment where the pianist could show off, where technique and emotion combined into something magical. Instead, it sounded like someone had put a blanket over the piano. All the colors and dynamics he normally created were just gone, swallowed by the instrument's limitations. He made it through about 20 minutes before Peter stopped the orchestra. The conductor's enthusiastic smile had faded into something more diplomatic. "Let's take a short break," Peter announced. The musicians gratefully set down their instruments. Victor stood up from the piano bench, flexing his fingers. They actually hurt, which almost never happened. He'd built up decades of strength and endurance, but fighting against stuck keys and stiff action for 20 minutes had taken a toll. Peter approached carefully, like someone approaching an angry dog. Well, we've got some things to work on. The piano is badly out of tune," Victor said flatly. "Several keys stick. The action is inconsistent across the keyboard, and the tone is muddy in the bass and harsh in the treble. Yes, well, it does have character. Character is one thing. This is a malfunction." Mrs. Pemberton had made her way onto the stage. Her expression suggested she'd heard every word. "Mr. Antonov, might I have a word?" Victor followed her to the side of the stage, away from the orchestra. She turned to face him, her posture rigid with barely contained irritation. "I understand you're accustomed to modern instruments," she began, her voice tight. "But this piano has been played by legends. Surely with your experience you can adjust your technique accordingly." Victor stared at her for a long moment. "Adjust my technique?" "Yes. Previous performers have managed perfectly well. Perhaps you need to approach it more delicately. Use a lighter touch. Mrs. Pemberton, I've been playing piano since I was 4 years old. I've performed on instruments across 3 continents. I know the difference between an instrument with character and an instrument that needs repair." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting our piano isn't adequate?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you directly. This piano is not in condition for a professional performance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mrs. Pemberton's face flushed red. "This instrument is a priceless historical artifact. It has been maintained according to strict period-appropriate standards. If you cannot appreciate its value, perhaps we've made a mistake in booking you." Victor felt his jaw tighten. He'd dealt with difficult venue managers before, but this was absurd. The piano was objectively in poor condition. This wasn't a matter of opinion or artistic preference. It was simple fact. "Perhaps we have," he said quietly. Mrs. Pemberton looked shocked that he'd agreed. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking against the stage floor. Peter hurried over. "Victor, please. Let's not be hasty. We can work something out, can we? Because from where I'm standing, I have 2 choices. I can either perform on an instrument that makes me sound like an amateur, or I can walk away and damage my reputation by backing out of a confirmed performance. There has to be a third option." Victor looked at the piano again. Part of him wanted to walk out right now. Get on a plane back to Berlin and forget this entire mess. But another part of him, the part that had driven him to master one of the hardest professions in the world, refused to quit. "Let's finish the rehearsal," he said finally. "I need to understand exactly how bad this is." They resumed playing. If anything, the second half was worse than the first. The orchestra tried their best, but you could see the concern on their faces. The principal violinist kept glancing at Victor with something like sympathy. The cellists looked uncomfortable. Even the percussion section, who weren't directly involved in most of the piece, seemed disturbed by what they were hearing. When they finally finished, the applause from the few staff members watching was polite but subdued. Everyone knew what they'd just heard wasn't good. Victor packed up his sheet music, though he barely needed it. As he was leaving, several orchestra members approached him quietly. "Is there anything we can do?" the principal violinist asked. "We all heard it. That piano is terrible." "I don't know yet," Victor admitted, "but thank you for saying something." Walking back to his hotel through London's drizzly afternoon, Victor replayed the rehearsal in his mind. The performance was scheduled for tomorrow evening. Tickets were sold out. People were expecting something special, and right now he had no idea how to give it to them. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Pemberton. "Professional and curt. The board requests your presence at 7 p.m. tonight for a brief meeting." Victor stared at the message. A brief meeting? Right. They were probably going to try to blame him for the disaster of a rehearsal, suggest again that his technique needed adjustment, maybe even threaten to cancel and blame it on him. He typed back a single word. "Confirmed." Then he sat down on a bench in a small park, watching people hurry past with their umbrellas, and started planning what he was going to say. Victor arrived at the Royal Albert Hall 15 minutes early. He'd learned long ago that being early to difficult meetings gave you time to observe, to read the room before anyone else knew you were there. He found the conference room and paused outside the door. Voices drifted through, tense and hurried. "We can't cancel now. Do you know how much money we'd lose? The reviews will be terrible if we go forward. Did you hear that rehearsal? Maybe if we adjust the lighting, make it more atmospheric, people won't notice as much." Victor pushed the door open. 7 people sat around the table. Mrs. Pemberton, the 2 staff members from before, and 4 others he didn't recognize. Probably board members, judging by their expensive suits and the way they sat like they owned the place. Everyone stopped talking when he entered. The silence felt heavy, awkward. Victor took the empty seat at the opposite end of the table from Mrs. Pemberton. He didn't say anything. Just waited. An older man with white hair and thick glasses cleared his throat. "Mr. Antonov, thank you for coming. I'm Richard Thornberry, chairman of the board. We wanted to discuss tomorrow's performance." "I assumed so." "Yes, well, we understand there were some difficulties during rehearsal today." Victor almost laughed. Difficulties, that was one way to put it. The piano is in poor condition. That's not a difficulty. That's a fact. Mrs. Pemberton jumped in immediately. "What Mr. Thornberry means is that we need to find a way forward. The performance is tomorrow. Tickets are sold. We have commitments to our patrons." "I'm aware of the commitments," Victor said calmly. "I'm also aware that asking me to perform on that instrument is setting both of us up for failure." Another board member, a woman in her 40s with sharp features, leaned forward. "Mr. Antonov, with respect, we've hosted hundreds of performers on that piano. Many of them praised its unique qualities. Then they were either lying to be polite or they weren't very good pianists." The room went completely silent. Victor could see Mrs. Pemberton's face turning red again. But he was done being diplomatic. If they wanted honesty, he'd give them honesty. Richard cleared his throat again. "That's quite a statement. It's a true statement. That piano needs extensive work. The tuning is off. Multiple keys stick. The action is inconsistent. These aren't matters of opinion. Any qualified piano technician could confirm what I'm saying in 5 minutes. The piano has been maintained according to historical standards," Mrs. Pemberton said through gritted teeth. "Perhaps the issue is with the performer's approach rather than the instrument." Victor turned to look at her directly. "Mrs. Pemberton, I've performed on some of the finest instruments in the world. I've also performed on mediocre ones and made them sound good. But there's a limit to what technique can overcome. If I go out there tomorrow and play on that piano as is, it won't matter how good I am. The audience will hear a subpar performance and they'll blame me for it." "So what are you suggesting?" Richard asked. "Cancel the performance?" I'm suggesting you face reality. You have a piano that's more historical decoration than functional instrument. You can either let me bring in a technician to do emergency repairs tonight, or we cancel. Those are the only two options. Mrs. Pemberton stood up abruptly. Absolutely not. We are not letting anyone touch that piano with unauthorized modifications. It's irreplaceable. It's also unplayable. You're being dramatic. Victor stood up too. He'd had enough. I'm being dramatic? You brought me here to perform one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire on an instrument that can barely play scales. And when I point out the obvious problem, you tell me to adjust my technique. That's not professionalism. That's delusion. The room erupted. 3 people started talking at once. Mrs. Pemberton looked like she might actually throw something. Richard was trying to calm everyone down, his voice rising above the chaos. Victor waited. He'd said what needed to be said. Now they could either accept reality or prove they were beyond reason. Finally, Richard raised his hand for silence. Everyone, please. This isn't helping. He turned to Victor. What exactly would a technician need to do? At minimum, tune the piano properly. Fix the sticking keys. Adjust the action so it's consistent. None of that would damage the instrument. It would just make it functional. How long would that take? With the right person? 6 to 8 hours, maybe more. Mrs. Pemberton shook her head vigorously. This is unacceptable. Mr. Antonov, if you cannot perform as agreed, perhaps we should discuss breach of contract. Victor smiled then. Not a friendly smile. The smile of someone who'd just heard something truly ridiculous. By all means, let's discuss contracts. I agreed to perform on a professional-grade instrument. What you've provided is neither professional nor properly maintained. If anyone's in breach, it's you. That got everyone's attention. The board members exchanged worried glances. Richard looked like he'd just swallowed something sour. Perhaps we should take a moment to calm down, one of the quieter board members suggested. But Victor wasn't done. He'd been thinking about this all afternoon, and now that he'd started, he might as well finish. Here's what I find interesting. You people talk constantly about this piano's history, about all the great musicians who've played it. But you know what actual great musicians do? They make sure their instruments are in top condition. They don't treat them like museum pieces. They treat them like tools that need maintenance and care. That's exactly what we've done, Mrs. Pemberton protested. No, you've preserved it. There's a difference. Preservation is about keeping something looking the same. Maintenance is about keeping something working properly. You've chosen preservation over function, and now you're angry that someone's pointing it out. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, a real genuine laugh of someone who'd just heard an uncomfortable truth they couldn't deny. He's not wrong, Richard said, looking around the table. We've been so focused on the piano's historical value that we've forgotten it needs to actually work. Mrs. Pemberton looked betrayed. Richard, you can't be serious. Catherine, I've been on this board for 12 years. This is the 3rd time we've had complaints about that piano. Maybe it's time we listened. Victor sat back down. This was interesting. He'd expected them to double down, to defend their position no matter what. Instead, the chairman was actually considering reason. So here's my proposal, Victor said, his voice calmer now. Let me bring in a technician tonight. Someone I trust. They'll do basic repairs. Nothing that would alter the piano's character. Just make it playable. In exchange, I'll do something for you. What? Richard asked. I'll acknowledge the piano's history during the performance. I'll tell the audience about it. I'll explain what makes it special. But I'll do it honestly. No false reverence. No pretending problems don't exist. Real honesty about both its value and its limitations. Mrs. Pemberton looked horrified. You want to tell our patrons that the piano has problems? I want to tell them the truth. And here's why that's actually good for you. Right now, if I perform tomorrow on that piano as is, everyone will hear the problems and wonder what's wrong. They'll think either the piano is bad or I'm bad. But if I acknowledge it up front, if I turn it into part of the story, suddenly it becomes interesting. It becomes human. People respect honesty. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, thoughtful rather than hostile. That's quite a gamble, Richard said slowly. Everything about this performance is a gamble at this point. At least this way, we're gambling on something interesting. Richard looked around the table. All in favor? 4 hands went up. Mrs. Pemberton kept hers firmly down, her expression furious. "Motion carries," Richard said. "Mr. Antonov, get your technician." "You have until tomorrow afternoon." Victor stood and nodded. "Thank you. You won't regret this." As he left the room, he heard Mrs. Pemberton's voice rise in protest behind him, but he didn't care anymore. He had work to do, and less than 24 hours to do it. Victor made 3 phone calls from the hotel lobby. The first was to his assistant in Berlin, asking her to track down the best piano technician she could find who was currently in London. The second was to cancel his dinner reservation. The third was to order 6 cups of strong coffee to his room. By 9 o'clock that evening, a man named Thomas Chen arrived at the Royal Albert Hall, carrying 2 large cases of tools. He was in his 60s, with steady hands and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of expertise. Victor had worked with him twice before, once in Vienna and once in Amsterdam. Thomas was expensive, but he was worth every penny. They stood together on the empty stage, looking at the piano under the harsh work lights. Thomas walked around it slowly, examining it from every angle. Then he sat down and played a few scales, his face neutral but his eyes missing nothing. "Well?" Victor asked. Thomas stood up and opened the lid, peering inside at the strings and hammers. "This is going to take a while." "When's the performance?" "Tomorrow night. 7 o'clock, Thomas whistled low. "You don't give a man much time, do you?" "I didn't create this problem. I'm just trying to fix it." "Fair enough." Thomas set down his cases and started unpacking tools. "I can get it playable. Won't be perfect, but it'll be functional. The tuning alone is going to take 3 hours. What else? 6 keys are sticking. The action is inconsistent across about 2 octaves. Some of the dampers aren't releasing properly, and whoever last worked on this used the wrong type of lubricant on the action. It's gummed up in places." Victor felt his jaw tighten. "They said it was maintained to historical standards. Maybe it was. Doesn't mean those standards were any good." Thomas pulled out a tuning hammer. "You should go get some sleep. This is going to be boring to watch." But Victor stayed. He pulled a chair over and sat in the front row watching Thomas work. There was something meditative about it. The way Thomas would strike a key, listen carefully, make a tiny adjustment, strike it again. Over and over. Each note had to be perfect, or as close to perfect as possible given the piano's age and condition. Around midnight, a security guard came by to check on them. He looked surprised to find anyone there so late. "Working on the piano?" he asked unnecessarily. "Emergency repairs," Victor said. The guard nodded knowingly. "About time. I've heard 3 different pianists complain about that thing in the past year. Management never listens." After the guard left, Thomas chuckled. "Guess you weren't the first to notice." "No, just the first to make enough noise about it. They worked through the night." Well, Thomas worked. Victor mostly watched and occasionally fetched tools or held a flashlight. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas took a break and they shared the last of the coffee, now cold and bitter. "You really going to tell the audience about this?" Thomas asked. "About what?" "About the piano's problems. I heard you made a deal with the board." Word traveled fast. "Yes, I'm going to be honest with them. That's risky. People come to these concerts expecting perfection. People come expecting authenticity. There's a difference." Thomas considered this while sipping his terrible coffee. "My grandfather was a piano maker in Shanghai. He used to say that perfect pianos are boring. The interesting ones have character. But character and broken aren't the same thing." "Exactly. That's what I've been trying to explain to Mrs. Pemberton. Good luck with that. I met her once. She tried to tell me I was tuning a piano wrong. A piano I'd been working on for 30 years. Victor laughed, actually laughed for the first time in 2 days. "That sounds about right." By 5 in the morning, Thomas had the piano tuned and most of the mechanical issues fixed. He played through some scales and arpeggios, nodding with satisfaction. "Try it now," he said to Victor. Victor sat at the bench. His eyes felt gritty with exhaustion, but his mind was alert. He played the opening of the Rachmaninoff. It was better. Not perfect, but immensely better than yesterday. The keys responded properly. The tone was clearer. He could actually control the dynamics now. "It's good," he said. "Really good." "Thank you." Thomas packed up his tools. "Don't thank me yet. You still have to actually perform on it." After Thomas left, Victor stayed at the piano. He was too tired to go back to the hotel now. Instead, he started playing through his program. But something felt wrong. The Rachmaninoff, while technically possible now, still didn't feel right for this piano. It was too demanding, too aggressive. The instrument was better than before, but it was still old, still delicate. He stopped playing and just sat there thinking. The hall was completely silent except for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Dawn light was starting to filter through the high windows. Then it hit him. He'd been approaching this all wrong. He'd been trying to force the piano to do what he wanted instead of working with what it could actually do well. That was the mistake everyone had been making. Mrs. Pemberton wanted it to be something it wasn't. He'd wanted it to play pieces it couldn't handle. Victor pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his mental catalog of pieces. He needed something that would work with the piano's limitations rather than fight against them. Something that could sound intentional, even beautiful, with the instrument's particular character. He thought about Eric Satie. Simple, spare, almost meditative. The kind of music where silence mattered as much as sound. On this piano, that could actually work. The slight imperfections might even add to the atmosphere. For the finale, he needed something crowd-pleasing, but forgiving. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody came to mind. It was showy, but in a way that didn't require the absolute precision of Rachmaninoff. The rubato, the freedom of timing, could cover a multitude of small imperfections. He started playing through the new program. Sarti's Gymnopédie No. 1 sounded almost magical on the old piano. The slightly muted tone gave it an antique quality that felt appropriate. Then he moved into some Chopin nocturnes. They worked beautifully. The piano's limitations became assets, creating an intimate chamber music feeling. By the time he finished experimenting, it was 7 in the morning. He felt exhausted but energized. He'd cracked the puzzle. This could actually work. Victor went back to his hotel, showered, and tried to sleep. But his mind was racing with ideas. He kept thinking about what he'd say to the audience. How to frame this. How to turn a potential disaster into something memorable. Around noon, he gave up on sleep and started writing notes. He'd never been good at public speaking. He preferred to let his playing do the talking. But tonight required words. The right words. Honest but not bitter. Critical but not cruel. He wrote and rewrote his introduction a dozen times. Too formal, too casual, too long, too short. Finally, he settled on something simple and direct. He'd tell them the truth, add a touch of humor, and trust that they'd appreciate the honesty. At 4 o'clock, he returned to the hall for a final run-through. The orchestra was there, looking curious. Peter, the conductor, approached immediately. "I heard you had quite a night. How's the piano?" "Better. But we're changing the program." Peter's eyes widened. "Changing it? The concert is in 3 hours." "I know, but trust me, this will work better." He explained the new program. Peter looked skeptical but willing. They ran through the pieces quickly. The orchestra adapted well. Professional musicians always did. At 6 o'clock, Victor went backstage to the dressing room. He could hear the audience arriving. The murmur of hundreds of conversations, the rustle of programs, the excited anticipation. In 90 minutes, he'd walk out onto that stage. He looked at himself in the mirror. His suit was pressed, his hair was neat. He looked like he'd slept well, even though he hadn't slept at all. That was the magic of good lighting and better coffee. There was a knock on the door. Richard, the board chairman, poked his head in. "Just wanted to wish you luck, and to say thank you for pushing back, for being honest." Victor nodded. "Let's see if I can actually pull this off." "You will. I have a feeling this is going to be a night people remember." After Richard left, Victor sat quietly, breathing deeply, centering himself. This was it. Time to find out if honesty and adaptation could turn disaster into triumph. The lights dimmed in the Royal Albert Hall. 2,000 people settled into their seats, programs rustling to a stop. Victor stood in the wings, watching the stage manager give him a 30-second signal. His heart was beating faster than usual, which almost never happened anymore. After 20 years of performances, stage fright had become a distant memory. But tonight was different. The stage manager nodded. Victor walked out into the lights. The applause was warm, respectful. He could see faces in the first few rows, eager, expectant, dressed in their finest clothes for a night at the symphony. They had no idea what they were about to experience. He didn't sit at the piano immediately. Instead, he walked to the microphone at the front of the stage. This wasn't standard. Usually pianists just came out, bowed, sat down, and played. The audience seemed slightly confused by the deviation from protocol. "Good evening," Victor said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Before I begin tonight's performance, I need to tell you about this piano." He gestured to the instrument behind him. The audience was completely silent now, uncertain where this was going. "This is an 1847 Broadwood piano. It's a genuine piece of history. It's been on this stage for over a century. Some truly remarkable musicians have played it." He paused, letting that sink in. "It has also survived wars, revolutions, and apparently regular maintenance." A few uncertain laughs rippled through the audience. Victor smiled slightly. "When I arrived here 3 days ago, I was told I'd be performing on this historic instrument. What they didn't mention was that historic doesn't always mean functional. This piano was badly out of tune, several keys stuck. The action was inconsistent. It was, to be perfectly honest, a disaster." More laughter now, though some people looked scandalized. In the fifth row, Victor could see Mrs. Pemberton's face turning red, but Richard, sitting next to her, was smiling. "Now I could have walked away, I could have demanded a different piano. But here's what I realized last night at 3 a.m. while a wonderful technician named Thomas was fixing sticky keys. We spend so much time chasing perfection that we forget something important. Music isn't about perfect instruments or flawless technique. It's about connection. It's about honesty. It's about taking what you have and making something beautiful with it." The hall was absolutely silent now. Victor could feel the shift in the room. They were with him. "So tonight you're going to hear me play on a 177-year-old piano that will never be perfect. The tone won't be as bright as a modern Steinway. Some notes will sound different than others. There will be imperfections. But here's what our ancestors understood that we sometimes forget. Those imperfections are part of the story. This piano has lived a life. It has character. And tonight, instead of fighting against that, I'm going to work with it." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I've changed tonight's program. Instead of the Rachmaninoff I'd planned, I'm going to play pieces that suit this instrument's personality. Music that can shine even on an imperfect piano. Because at the end of the day, that's what we all are, aren't we? A little bit imperfect, trying our best and hoping to create something worthwhile anyway." The applause that followed was different, warmer, more personal. Victor walked to the piano and sat down. He placed his hands on the keys, took a breath, and began. He started with Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. The simple, haunting melody floated through the hall. And something magical happened. The old piano's slightly muted tone, which would have killed the Rachmaninoff, made the Satie sound like it was being played in a distant room from long ago. It was perfect. Not technically perfect. Emotionally perfect. Victor felt himself relax into the music. He wasn't fighting the instrument anymore. They were working together. When he reached a key that responded slightly differently, he used it, made it part of the phrasing, turned a limitation into an artistic choice. He moved into a Chopin nocturne. The audience was completely still, hanging on every note. This was what he loved about performing, not the applause or the accolades, but these moments of shared experience. 2,000 people breathing together, feeling together, connected through sound. The first half of the program flew by. Debussy, more Satie, some Schubert. Pieces that lived in the piano's sweet spot. When he finished the first half, the applause was thunderous. People were on their feet. Victor bowed and walked off stage, genuinely surprised by the response. Backstage, Peter grabbed his shoulder. "That was incredible. I've never heard that piano sound so good." "It helps when you stop asking it to be something it's not," Victor said. During intermission, Victor could hear the buzz of excited conversation from the audience. Through a crack in the curtain, he watched people gesturing animatedly, discussing what they'd just heard. This was good. They were engaged. invested in the story. The second half opened with more intimate pieces, building gradually toward the finale. Victor had carefully structured it like a journey, taking the audience deeper into the music with each piece. He played some Bach, letting the mathematical beauty of the counterpoint shine through. Then some Brahms, romantic and warm. Finally, it was time for the closer. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. It was a crowd pleaser, the kind of piece that made people want to jump out of their seats. Flashy, dramatic, with moments of quiet beauty between the fireworks. Victor launched into it with complete confidence. His fingers flew over the keys. The old piano, properly tuned and adjusted, kept up beautifully. This piece was forgiving in all the right ways. The rubato, the freedom of timing, let him dance around any small imperfections. And the dramatic flourishes, the big chords and rapid runs sounded spectacular. He could feel the audience leaning forward in their seats. This was why people came to live performances. This energy, this moment, this connection. You couldn't get it from a recording. You had to be there, in the room, sharing the experience. Victor played the final massive chord and held it, letting it ring through the hall. Then silence. 1 beat, 2 beats. And then the entire audience exploded. People were on their feet immediately, applauding, cheering. The sound was overwhelming. Victor stood and bowed. The applause continued. He bowed again, still applauding. He gestured to the orchestra, who stood. More applause. Peter came out and shook his hand. The applause grew even louder. He looked out at the audience. In the 5th row, Mrs. Pemberton was standing, applauding with everyone else. Her face was wet with tears. She caught his eye and nodded, a small gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. Victor sat back down and played an encore. Something simple and beautiful, a Chopin waltz. The audience listened in reverent silence, and when he finished, the applause started all over again. Backstage afterward, he was surrounded by people. Board members, orchestra musicians, staff members. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how moved they were. Richard pushed through the crowd. That was extraordinary, truly. You turned what could have been a disaster into something people will talk about for years. The piano did most of the work, Victor said. I just stopped fighting it. Later, alone in his dressing room, Victor sat quietly. His phone was buzzing with messages. Reviews were already posting online, all positive. Some called it the best performance they'd seen all year. But what struck him most was the realization that he'd learned something tonight. After 20 years of playing perfectly in perfect concert halls on perfect instruments, he'd forgotten that imperfection could be beautiful too. That honesty mattered more than polish. That connection was worth more than technical perfection. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time before heading back to his hotel. Same face, same hands, but something had shifted. He'd come to London expecting another routine performance. Instead, he'd been reminded why he fell in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about the perfect piano or the prestigious venue or the impressive technique. It was about taking what you have, being honest about its limitations, and creating something beautiful anyway. That was the real performance. That was what mattered. And somehow a witty remark about wars, revolutions, and regular maintenance had paved the way for him to remember it.